The morning at Hogwarts smelled of fried bacon, fresh buns, and the anxious anticipation of the first autumn exams. The great hall was filled with the usual cacophony of voices, the clatter of plates, and the bustling movement of owls delivering mail. September rays, still warm but no longer summery, streamed through the high Gothic windows, illuminating the floating candles and the golden plates polished to a shine. Theoden Voxwell, a tall 14-year-old Slytherin with already famous cold gray eyes and a perpetual notebook in his hand, pushed away his plate of unfinished oatmeal. His attention, as usual, was unfocused, catching snippets of dozens of conversations simultaneously. He was a spider at the center of a web, and every trembling thread told him something. Today, the threads were vibrating strangely, not like before an exam, when the anxiety was sticky and predictable. There was a foolish, almost theatrical hysteria in the air, and I'm telling you, it was a real basilisk, came from the Gryffindor table. No, just a very large garden lizard that the Weasley twins set on me, retorted his neighbor. Theoden mentally noted, standard pre-exam hallucinations, nothing serious. But the first real signal came from the other end of the hall, a loud, unnaturally pompous cry from the Hufflepuff table. Oh, treacherous friend, and you dared to raise a hand against me, a hand sullied by betrayal. Theoden slowly, with the unflappable air of a connoisseur observing a rare butterfly species, turned his head. Two inseparable Hufflepuff friends, Dirk Cresswell and Frederick Embry, who usually shared the last sausage and copied homework from each other, were standing opposite one another. Crimson with rage, Dirk, trembling, was holding not a knife, but a harmless fork, yet he held it as if it were a conspirator's blade. "I would rather be a dog in a kennel than an unworthy knight like you," shouted Frederick, forcefully throwing a piece of toast to the floor, which bounced off and landed right in the soup of a first year. Professor Sprout, whose kindly face rarely expressed anything but calm wisdom, was forced to stand up. Her movements, usually fluid, were now sharp and decisive. "Dirk, Frederick, stop this immediately." Her voice rang out so commandingly that even the Gryffindors fell silent for a second. Grown wizards do not behave like rampaging pixies. Minus 10 points from Hufflepuff for food waste and public scandal. Theoden took an elegant black quill from behind his ear, a gift from his father, a prestigious magical lawyer, and made his first neat note in his leather notebook. Anomaly 1, D. Cresswell, and F. Embry, Hufflepuff. Sharp behavioral shift. Version: conflict over a girl, homework, monitoring. He didn't yet know that this was just the first, rather harmless act of the beginning madness, and that the real spectacle was only preparing to raise its curtain. The second act, far more spectacular and alarming, played out an hour later on the Quidditch pitch, where Theoden had been led by a chain of rumors about strangeness with the first years. Madam Hooch, having gathered the Gryffindor newcomers for their first ever flying lesson, found with a rare expression of confusion on her face that a group of 6 people had frozen into a perfect, yet completely immobile, pyramid. They stood with their arms outstretched, holding their brooms like spears, their faces contorted with grim determination, their eyes fixed on a single point on the horizon. "Come on, children," shouted Madam Hooch, unsuccessfully trying to get their attention. "Enough fooling around. Take your brooms as I showed you. We are the unbreakable phalanx of Alexander the Great," proclaimed one of them, a ruddy boy with freckles named Colin Creevey. "We shall not move until the signal to attack is given." Madam Hooch, accustomed to ordinary timidity, or, at worst, to prankish antics, but not to such organized and senseless stupidity, called for Professor McGonagall in complete bewilderment. The latter, appearing on the pitch with a face carved from granite, did not waste time on persuasion. Her gaze, cold and sharp as a razor, swept over the phalanx, assessing the scale of the folly. "Enough," she said in an icy tone, and her wand described a sharp arc in the air. The 6 first years instantly froze like statues under the full body bind curse. Another slight movement of McGonagall's wand, and the petrified students smoothly rose into the air and floated towards the castle, to the hospital wing, accompanied by an irritated Madam Hooch. Theoden, observing this from a castle balcony, frowned. This no longer resembled a simple school scuffle or a prank. A new, more detailed entry appeared in his notebook. Anomaly 2 Group Behavioral Anomaly, Gryffindor, First Year. Coordinated Actions, Scenario, Historical Reenactment, Macedonian Phalanx. Version, Mass Hysteria, Organized Joke, too coordinated for first years, requires study. But the real nightmare, which made even Theoden momentarily freeze in pure, unadulterated astonishment at the sheer absurdity of it all, erupted in Snape's dungeon on Tuesday. The irony was that Theoden was there not as an observer, but as a full participant. The second-year Slytherins just happened to have a joint potions lesson with the Gryffindors. The air in the dungeon classroom was thick with the acrid fumes of boiling cauldrons and the smell of pickled frogs' legs. Snape's voice, sliding between tables like a venomous snake, hissed sarcastic comments that made many Gryffindors' ears turn red. "I assume even the most primitive mind could distinguish a horned slug from a flobberworm, Miss Brown," he hissed, peering into the cauldron of one of the Gryffindor girls. "But it seems I expected too much." Theoden stood at his cauldron, stirring his draught of peaceful sleep with feigned indifference. He had already noted several interesting observations in his notebook. Percy Weasley looked particularly nervous, and Draco Malfoy and his cronies were whispering intensively in a corner, glancing at the Gryffindors. Everything was as usual, and then, exactly at the moment when Snape turned to the blackboard to write down the next stage of the potion, a loud, abrupt knocking sound was heard, not random, but rhythmic. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. The knocking of inkwells on wooden desktops. Theoden, standing at his cauldron, slowly raised his eyes. The scene that met his gaze was so surreal that his brain refused to process it for a second. The entire second-year Gryffindor cohort, as if on an invisible command, jumped to their feet. They formed a flawless line, having discarded their brooms and forgotten their cauldrons, and, beating out that very rhythm with their inkwells, began to march in place, and not just march. They started to sing, loudly, hoarsely, and with surprisingly good coordination, as if they had been rehearsing it for weeks. "Arise, children of the fatherland, the day of glory has arrived." La Marseillaise. The fierce, frantic march echoed under the gloomy dungeon vaults, deafening and utterly insane. The boiling cauldron seemed to fall silent, overwhelmed by the power of this choir. The Slytherins stood frozen with their mouths agape, some with genuine fear in their eyes. Even Malfoy was speechless, his usual smug smirk sliding off his face, replaced by bewilderment. Snape turned around slowly, very slowly. His face, usually pale, became the color of old parchment. Not a muscle twitched, but his black eyes held a storm of silent, icy fury that seemed to freeze the very air in the classroom. The silence that fell when the Gryffindors, having exhaled, fell silent, was more deafening than any thunder Gryffindor. Snape hissed, and his voice was like the screech of a knife on glass. Minus 100 points for disruptive behavior, for obstructing the educational process, for this. He made a short, abrupt gesture with his hand, as if lost for words. And you will all be scrubbing wolfish glands without gloves until Christmas. If, he added with a Swedish venom, your fingers are still attached by then. But even this prospect didn't immediately bring the Gryffindors back to reality. They looked at Snape with empty, unseeing eyes, as if he were a jailer in the Bastille, and they were noble revolutionaries ready to ascend the scaffold. Theoden Voxwell carefully covered his cauldron, protecting the potion from overheating. He set aside his quill, and his gaze became sharp and tenacious, like a falcon spotting its prey. Before him was not a collection of disparate curiosities. This was a system, clear, frightening, and utterly irrational. He turned a page of his notebook and wrote in large, confident letters, Investigation, Number 1. Code name, ink fever. Nature, unknown. Cause, unknown. Goal, to identify. Threat, potential chaos. He didn't know that he would very soon need the help of a star-obsessed Ravenclaw botanist and the knowledge of a quiet, inconspicuous Hufflepuff girl who always smelled of books and ink. But he felt it. The hunt had begun. And it was a hunt for a ghost whose weapon was ridiculous, but whose consequences could be far more serious than they first appeared. Chapter 2. The Trail Leads to the Library. As befits any self-respecting detective, Theoden began his investigation by searching for a common denominator. His network of informants, carefully built over the previous 2 years, was put on full alert. The task was simple. Find out what all the victims had in common in the 24 hours before the incident. Answers started coming in by evening. His agent in Gryffindor, a younger Weasley, for a couple of chocolate frogs and a promise not to tell Fred and George about his secret knitting hobby, reported that the rebels had all been preparing their history of magic homework together the day before. In the library, his agent in Hufflepuff, a girl with an almost photographic memory, in exchange for help translating a complex runic spell, confirmed. Dirk and Fred had also spent the evening in the library, working on a joint herbology project. The library. That was the first clear lead. The next morning, Theoden went there. The air in the vast hall with high vaulted ceilings, usually thick and calm, was filled with a strange tension today. The usual silence was broken. In a corner, buried in scrolls, a first-year Ravenclaw known as a quiet swat was enthusiastically covering parchment with complex labyrinths, muttering something about the Minotaur and Ariadne's thread. 2 Slytherin girls, hidden behind a bookshelf with ancient runes books, were arguing heatedly, imitating dialogues from some novel about rival magical dynasties, their hissing voices sounding unnaturally pompous. Theoden settled nearby, pretending to study magical law theory, and activated his main weapon, his hearing. He caught snippets of phrases slipping through the whispers and rustling of pages. I just couldn't tear myself away. I just got so into the role. It was so realistic, like I was really there. And this ink, see how it shimmers? Ink. This word, accidentally dropped by one of the Slytherin girls, stuck in Theoden's mind. He didn't pay it much attention at first. Just ink. Everyone uses it. He decided to test the targeted curse theory. Approaching the table where the Slytherin girls were sitting, he gave a polite bow. "Excuse the interruption," he said, his voice even and neutral. "Did you notice anyone suspicious in the library last evening? Perhaps someone looking at you strangely, muttering something. Some students are behaving inappropriately today." The girls exchanged glances. One of them, with a sharp, intelligent face, swallowed convulsively and shoved her hand into her robe pocket, hiding something. "No," she replied sharply. "No one. We were just studying." But her gaze, quick and frightened, darted to an empty ink vial lying on the table. Theoden made out the label, "Shimmering Sapphire." He stepped back, mentally adjusting his notes. Version number 1, targeted curse. Probability decreasing. Victims are ashamed or afraid of something related to their condition. Perhaps the curse was placed on an object? On the ink? Leaving the library, Theoden bumped into Madame Pince in the doorway, who was leading out that very first-year Ravenclaw boy. The boy was walking, staring into emptiness, and mooing like a bull in response to all the nurse's questions. "No physical injuries," Theoden heard her muttering to herself as she led him by the arm. "Mind clouded, like a strong confundus, and he smells of ink. Shimmering sapphire. Pah!" Theoden froze. The curse theory finally crumbled. It smelled of ink. That was the key. But what kind? He almost ran to Honeyduke's. The shop was full of students, and many of them were crowding around the stationery counter, demanding that very ink, shimmering sapphire. Mr. Flappity, the owner, was handing out small glass vials to all comers and smiling happily. "Last batch. Only a few left." Theoden bought one vial. The ink looked perfectly normal, thick, bluish, with a slight shimmering effect, nothing more. He cautiously sniffed the vial. Just a faint, neutral scent, nothing that could cause such hallucinations. He stepped out into the square in front of the castle, clutching the cold glass vial in his hand, and felt the ground slipping from under his feet. His methods, always foolproof, were failing. The enemy was intangible. He stood, gazing at the serene sky, not knowing that at that very moment on the 7th floor of Hogwarts, a scene was unfolding that would provide him not only with the main clue, but also with two unexpected allies. Returning to the castle, Theoden decided to test another theory. If the ink was the key, where was the most logical place to use it? Back in the library, of course. He headed there, but this time his path led to the section of rare and ancient folios, a place usually imbued with a special, almost sacred silence. And it was there that he witnessed a strange scene. At one of the reading tables sat a petite girl in Hufflepuff robes, with chestnut hair tied in a messy bun. Before her lay a huge tome in a shabby binding, and next to it stood that very ill-fated vial of shimmering sapphire. But unlike the others, she wasn't engrossed in reading. She sat, pressed into the back of a chair, her shoulders tense, her face expressing not delight, but genuine fear. She was looking at the book as if it were about to bite her. This was Maretta Quillwood, and her reaction was unique of its kind throughout the entire day. While everyone else was either delightfully or uncomprehendingly succumbing to the ink's influence, she alone seemed to be resisting it. Theoden made a new note in his notebook. Perhaps he had just found not only a valuable observation, but also a future ally. Chapter 3. The Starship on the 7th Floor. Feeling frustrated by the dead end with the ink, Theoden wandered the corridors of the 7th floor, turning corners aimlessly. He almost mechanically recorded minor incidents in his notebook. A pair of second-year Gryffindors acting out a scene from Romeo and Juliet by the window. A lone Slytherin reciting a monologue from Hamlet to an empty corridor. The epidemic was gaining momentum, and he still didn't understand its mechanism. He was distracted by a strange, monotonous sound coming from behind the door of one of the abandoned classrooms, usually used for storing broken desks and globes. The sound was like muttering, but devoid of any emotional color, cold and methodical. Theoden cautiously opened the door a crack and peered inside. Elric Riddleway, that very 14-year-old prodigy from Ravenclaw, whose works on applied magical theory were sometimes quoted by the professors themselves, was sitting on the dusty floor with his back to the door. Around him was chaos of scattered parchment sheets, but it wasn't creative chaos. It was a system, an insane system. He was drawing, not his usual elegant formulas, but complex diagrams of star systems, flight trajectories, equations of motion in a vacuum. His handwriting, usually impeccable, was harsh, angular, and he was muttering incessantly, his voice even and lifeless, like a robot's. Accounting for Jupiter's gravitational field for gravity assist maneuver, calculating the point of no return, oxygen supply for 4.3 light years. His fingers, stained to the knuckles with the familiar bluish ink, convulsively clutched the quill. Shimmering Sapphire. Here too, and not just here, they had captured one of the clearest minds in Hogwarts. Theoden felt truly afraid. If this could break Riddleway. "Riddleway?" he called out cautiously, stepping over the threshold. "Elric, are you all right?" Elric slowly, very slowly, turned his head. His eyes, usually sharp and attentive, were empty. There was no thought, no awareness in them, only the infinite icy void of the cosmos he was reciting. "Crew member," he stated in the same monotone. "Report status. Life support systems nominal. Navigation computers. Reporting an error." He jabbed his quill at his drawings. "Recalculation required. Immediately." He wasn't here. His mind was soaring somewhere among the stars, locked in a capsule of his own madness. Theoden understood that logic and persuasion wouldn't work. He had to play by his rules. "Crew," said Theoden, trying to make his voice sound firm and official. "This is Mission Control. Your mission is complete. I order you to land for refueling and debriefing." Elric slowly turned his empty gaze towards him. "Confirm signal reception," he mumbled. "But navigation systems." "Systems are nominal." A quiet but confident voice came from the doorway. Theoden turned sharply. In the doorway stood the same girl from the library, Maretta Quillwood. Her face was as white as chalk, and her eyes, huge behind her glasses, were fixed on the crazed Elric. In her trembling hand she clutched an identical vial of shimmering sapphire. "It's just interference," she continued, taking a step forward. "You need to return to base. Right now. Captain's orders." They stood, holding their breath. Elric blinked, then again. The emptiness in his eyes began to dissipate, giving way to familiar clarity and wild embarrassment. He looked around the room, his stained hands, the insane drawings on the floor. What was that?" he muttered, brushing off his robes in disgust. "I saw stars and equations, so many equations." You got caught using this newfangled ink," Theoden explained dryly, handing him a handkerchief. "Shimmering Sapphire. Turns out it has a kick. Literally." While Elric was coming to his senses, Theoden watched Maretta carefully. The girl still looked frightened, but her eyes showed not panic, but rather puzzlement. She was examining the vial in her hand as if trying to read a hidden message on the label. "You used it too?" Theoden asked, nodding at the ink. Maretta flinched and hastily stuffed the vial into her pocket. I was taking notes for History of Magic, and then—" She fell silent, searching for words. Then it seemed like the old folios on the shelf started whispering to me, recounting their stories. It was enticing, but it became scary. "And you were able to stop?" Elric clarified. He was already on his feet, his gaze sharp and analytical again, though a shadow of embarrassment still hadn't left his face. "I just got really scared," Maretta admitted quietly. "I dropped my quill and ran away." At that moment, Theoden noticed something he had missed before. On the floor, next to Elric's drawings, lay a battered book. He picked it up. Basics of Astronautics for Beginners, a Muggle textbook. "So, it's not just hallucinations," Theoden concluded. "The ink, it somehow interacts with what you're reading, amplifies it, turns it into an obsession." Elric nodded, already fully composed. "Logical. I was studying this book yesterday for my magical physics project. The ink doesn't create images from nothing. It hyperbolizes narratives already present in the mind." "Narratives?" Maretta asked. "Plot," Theoden clarified. "It makes you live inside the plot you're interacting with." "But why? What's so special about it?" Maretta took out her vial again and held it up to the light coming through the dusty window. "Look," she whispered. "See? Tiny golden specks. They're not just glitter." "They're spores," Maretta said firmly. Her voice suddenly gained confidence, as if she were quoting a familiar text. "Of the fungus Somnium musa. It grows in the caves of the Pyrenees. The Encyclopedia of Magical Mycology says its spores in small doses are used to create potions that sharpen the imagination." Theoden and Elric examined the vial with interest. Indeed, microscopic golden particles floated in the thick blue liquid. "But if the concentration is too high," Maretta continued, "they don't sharpen the imagination, they completely capture it. A person loses the line between reality and fiction. They literally start living inside the story they are reading or thinking about." Elric nodded, his analytical mind already processing the new information. "The hypothesis is plausible. The spores act as a psychoactive catalyst. But a question remains. Who and why added them to the ink? And why did the epidemic start precisely now? And how do we stop it?" Theoden added. "While we're talking, half of Hogwarts is preparing either for the War of the Roses or for the conquest of the galaxy. 3 strangers from just half an hour ago now stood together, united by one strange secret. A Slytherin, a Ravenclaw, and a Hufflepuff. 3 different worlds, 3 different approaches." "Insufficient data," Elric stated. "We need an analysis of the ink and information on its origin." "I can look in the library for information about the manufactory that produces it," Maretta offered immediately. "And I'll analyze the chemical and magical composition," Elric added. "We need to understand what's so special about them. And I'll find out who supplied them to honeydukes And if there's anyone who suddenly got into home production, said Theoden, I have channels. They exchanged glances. A plan of action was outlined. The chance meeting in the abandoned classroom had unexpectedly laid the foundation for their strange alliance. Let's meet here again tomorrow after classes, Theoden proposed, with results. When Maretta and Elric left, Theoden remained in the room for a moment, surveying the scattered drawings. For the first time that day, something resembling a smile appeared on his face. Perhaps the chaos of the ink fever had brought with it something useful. A team. By the way, subscribe the channel if you like Hogwarts stories. Chapter 4. The Spore Theory and an Unexpected Alliance. The trio moved to a more suitable place for covert meetings, an abandoned arithmancy classroom on the 3rd floor where even ghosts rarely ventured. The dusty blackboards and complex numerological charts on the walls created a strange atmosphere for their emergency meeting. So, the hypothesis, began Elric, having cleared a small area on the table for his notes. The Shimmering Sapphire ink contains spores of the Somnium musa fungus in a concentration exceeding the safe norm. Upon contact with text possessing a strong emotional or narrative charge, the spores induce a state of hyper-immersion, where the reader loses connection with reality and identifies with the narrative. Theoden, lounging on the windowsill, was making his own notes. So, it's not a magical curse in the pure sense, more of a biomagical incident. But who and why added these spores to ordinary ink? Maretta, perched on a stack of old folios, added, in the directory of magical goods from last year, there's a mention that Shimmering Sapphire is a product of a small French manufactory, Nuances Étincelantes. Its owner, Madame Rosier, specializes in natural components. Natural? She certainly didn't lie about that, Theoden quipped grimly. But why did the ink start working only now? Mr. Flappity said he's been selling it for half a year. Elric pondered. Perhaps an incubation period was required. Or something at Hogwarts changed the magical background, activating the spores. He looked at Maretta. You managed to break free from the ink's influence. Any theory why? Maretta blushed and adjusted her glasses. I just got scared when the voices of the books became too loud. My fear turned out to be stronger than the allure. Interesting, said Elric. So, a strong contrasting emotional experience can break the connection. A useful observation. Theoden jumped off the windowsill. All right, we have a theory. Now for tactics. Maretta, find out everything about Madame Rosier and her suppliers. Elric, analyze the ink. Maybe find a way to neutralize it. And I'll deal with the distribution of the ink within Hogwarts. Distribution? Maretta was surprised. Need to find out if anyone has a sudden interest in potion making, Theoden explained, especially among those with access to the greenhouses or the potions classroom. Dividing the responsibilities, they dispersed. Theoden headed to the greenhouses. According to his information, that's where one could get rare fungi. Elric went to his secret laboratory, taking several vials of Shimmering Sapphire. Maretta buried herself in the library archives. By evening, each had initial results. Maretta discovered that Madame Rosier did indeed purchase Somnium musa spores from a supplier in the Pyrenees, but in very small quantities, for perfume experiments. Elric found that the spores in the ink were unstable and began releasing psychoactive substances upon contact with parchment. But the main breakthrough was made by Theoden. After questioning the goblin caretakers who cleaned the greenhouses, he learned that a sixth-year Hufflepuff, Oliver Dexton, who worked for Professor Sprout, had shown an unhealthy interest in poisonous fungi over the last 2 weeks and constantly smelled of ink. "Oliver Dexton," Theoden said when they gathered again in the arithmancy classroom, "a known failed inventor. Last year he tried to create ever-sharp scissors for mandrake pruning, spent a month in the hospital wing." "And he has access to the greenhouses," Elric nodded. "Probability of his involvement, 87%. "But why would he do it?" asked Maretta. Theoden smirked. "Why do people usually do stupid things? Money, fame, or both? Shimmering Sapphire became insanely popular. What if he decided to set up his own production?" They exchanged glances. The mystery was almost solved. All that remained was to find proof. "We need to catch him red-handed," Theoden concluded. "But we'll act carefully. If he realizes he's being watched, he might destroy the evidence." "I propose surveillance," said Elric. "From a mathematical standpoint, the probability of him repeating his actions in the same location is—" "Enough percentages," Theoden interrupted him. "We'll set a watch on him, tonight." Maretta paled slightly but nodded. For the first time in her life, a school mystery was turning into a real investigation, with night surveillance and suspects. Chapter 5. Night Watch in the Greenhouse. The plan was simple and risky. Set a night ambush in the greenhouses. If Oliver Dexton was indeed conducting his experiments there, he would surely come under the cover of darkness. Theoden procured an invisibility cloak, not without difficulty, having persuaded a trusting Gryffindor to lend it for an important matter against Slytherin. Elric prepared several empty test tubes for sample collection and a self-filling parchment for the log. Maretta, to her own surprise, volunteered to be the lookout. Her quiet step and ability to blend into the shadows were bound to be useful. Exactly at midnight, the trio, huddled under one invisibility cloak, which was extremely awkward given their height difference, sneaked to the greenhouses. The air was cold and damp, and a distant wolf howl came from the forbidden forest. They squeezed into the third greenhouse, the one where Professor Sprout grew the rarest and most dangerous plants. It smelled of earth, moisture, and something sweetly spicy. Hiding behind a massive tub with a Venus flytrap, they froze in anticipation. The minutes dragged on agonizingly slowly. Elric checked his test tubes. Theoden peered into the darkness, and Maretta seemed to breathe even more quietly than the others. Their patience was rewarded about an hour later. The greenhouse door creaked, and a plump figure in Hufflepuff robes slipped inside, looking around. Oliver Dexton. In one hand he held a lit wand, in the other a small cauldron and a bag stuffed with vials. "Idiot," Theoden whispered soundlessly. "Using Lumos in a place like this." Oliver didn't seem to consider himself an idiot. He confidently walked to the far corner of the greenhouse, where, among the giant leaves of some tropical plant, stood a small table littered with ingredients. He placed the cauldron on an improvised stand of bricks and started muttering something, consulting a battered notebook. "Take the base, add the stabilizer, now the main ingredient." He took a small pouch from his bag and with a triumphant look poured its contents into the cauldron. A cloud of golden dust rose into the air. "Spores," Maretta said quietly. "That's them." Theoden nodded. The evidence was clear, but now they had to act. They couldn't just jump out and accuse him. A sixth year could easily stun them all with one spell. They needed cunning. "Look," Elric whispered, "he's not just mixing ingredients. He's trying to stabilize the formula." Judging by his notes, the previous batches were too concentrated. Elric, meanwhile, was already examining the laboratory Oliver had left behind. "Primitive, but effective," he concluded, studying the notes. He was indeed trying to copy the Shimmering Sapphire formula, but didn't understand the properties of the spores. Each of his new batches was more dangerous than the last. "So, we need not just to catch him, but to convince him to stop these experiments," said Theoden. "Forceful methods won't work. He'll just become more cautious." "Logical," Elric agreed. "A psychological approach is needed." "I have an idea," Maretta said slowly. "We can use his own weapon against him." Both looked at her with interest. The plan began to take shape. Maretta's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. They wouldn't catch Oliver red-handed. They would make him destroy his own creation. To do this, they needed to play on his fears and ambitions. The next day, Theoden set his rumor network in motion. By noon, anxious whispers were already creeping through the castle. Supposedly, Headmaster Dumbledore had tasked Professor Snape with investigating the ink incident, and that Snape had developed a special tracking spell to find the source of the contaminated ink. The rumor was skillfully supplemented by a leak that Snape suspected a senior student and was planning a night search of the greenhouses. The effect was immediate. At lunch, Oliver Dexton looked pale and distraught. He kept glancing anxiously at the staff table, where Snape, of course, showed no signs of particular activity. Meanwhile, Elric worked on the technical part of the plan. Using the ink samples from the greenhouse, he created a small device, an enchanted scroll that, upon contact with Oliver's ink, began emitting faint magical pulses resembling the trace of a tracking spell. "This will work," Elric stated confidently, demonstrating the scroll. "The pulses will be noticeable to anyone performing elementary diagnostics." In the evening, the trio gathered in the greenhouse again. This time, they were better prepared. Theoden took up a position near the entrance. Elric hid behind shelves of poisonous plants, and Maretta settled on the watering balcony. It offered the best view. Oliver appeared exactly at midnight, as expected. He looked even more nervous than the previous night. Instead of getting straight to work, he first walked around the greenhouse several times, checking if anyone was inside. Then he pulled out his wand and began muttering diagnostic spells. "Looking for spell traces," Elric whispered soundlessly. "Perfect." Oliver indeed behaved like a cornered animal. He checked every corner before finally approaching his secret table. His hands trembled as he began preparing a new batch of ink. But this time, something was wrong. He kept looking around, listening to every rustle. "Now," Theoden whispered. Elric nodded and aimed his wand at the scroll lying near Oliver's work table. An almost imperceptible glow enveloped the scroll, and it began emitting those very pulses that were supposed to pass for traces of a tracking spell. Oliver didn't notice anything at first, but when he accidentally brushed against the scroll with his elbow, his face twisted in horror. He grabbed the scroll, examined it carefully, then cast another diagnostic spell. This time his wand flared brightly, indicating magical activity. No, he groaned. He's already been here. Snape knows. Chapter 6. Trap for the Amateur Potioneer. In a panic, Oliver began rushing around the greenhouse. He grabbed his vials, flasks, notes, clearly not knowing what to do with them. Throw them away? Hide them? Destroy them? It was at this moment that Theoden decided to strike the final blow. "Trouble, Dexton?" he asked in an icy tone. Oliver flinched so hard he nearly dropped his entire collection of vials. His eyes became as wide as saucers. "Voxwell, what are you... How did you..." "I know everything," Theoden said calmly. "I know about your little business. I know about the spores. And I know that Snape has already conducted his investigation here." He pointed to the scroll in Oliver's hands. "That's his marker. Tomorrow morning he's coming with a search." Oliver paled to the point of resembling a ghost. What should I do?" he whispered in horror. "There's only one way out," Theoden said, pausing for drama. "Destroy all the evidence, everything, to the last drop, and hope that Snape decides his information was inaccurate." Oliver looked at Theoden with a mixture of fear and hope. His hand shook as he gathered his vials and flasks into his bag. But how?" he mumbled. "If I destroy everything, how do I prove it was me? Maybe it's better to confess to Snape?" "Confess to Snape?" Theoden snorted. "Do you want to spend the rest of the school year scrubbing cauldrons of explosive residue? Or worse, get a couple of weeks in the hospital wing after one of his educational potions?" The thought of such an outcome seemed to finally paralyze Oliver. He looked around helplessly, as if seeking support from the Venus flytraps. "There is another option," Theoden said, changing tactics. "Destroy the evidence and act as if nothing happened. Snape will find an empty greenhouse and decide his information was wrong. And you..." Theoden made a meaningful pause. "You will simply stop these experiments forever." Oliver froze, considering the proposal. The struggle on his face was visible to the naked eye. On one hand, fear of Snape; on the other, it was a pity to part with a potential source of income and fame. "But the ink is so popular," he weakly tried to object. "That's precisely why Snape is interested," Theoden parried. "Do you think he'll allow some student to create uncontrolled psychotropic substances right under Dumbledore's nose?" This argument finally broke Oliver's resistance. He nodded with the look of a doomed martyr. All right, I'll destroy everything." He began feverishly gathering his laboratory, shoving into his bag not only the vials but also the notes and even spare quills. Theoden watched this with satisfaction, but understood they needed to secure their success. "Wait," he stopped Oliver. "You're not planning to just throw this in the trash, are you? Filch regularly checks the bins, and the house elves might tell." Oliver froze in indecision again. "Then what should I do?" "We need to destroy it so that not a trace remains," said Theoden. "There's one place." He led Oliver to the farthest corner of the greenhouse, where Professor Sprout kept a compost heap for particularly poisonous plants. The place was ideal. The caustic fumes and aggressive microflora were supposed to completely decompose any traces of potions. Under Theoden's supervision, Oliver, with the air of a man burying his own child, began destroying the fruits of his labor. He poured the ink into the compost, buried the vials, tore up the notes. Every movement was visibly difficult for him. The book, too. Theoden pointed to the battered guide on fungi. "But it's a rare edition," Oliver pleaded. and it's the first thing that will lead them to you, Theoden replied impassively. With a heavy sigh, Oliver consigned the book to the compost as well. When the last scrap of paper disappeared into the poisonous sludge, he stood with empty hands and a devastated gaze. "That's it," said Theoden. "Now forget it like a bad dream, and if I hear that you're trying to brew anything again—" He didn't finish, but his voice held such steel that Oliver involuntarily recoiled. I understand, not a word more." When Oliver, crestfallen, left the greenhouse, Elric and Maretta emerged from the shadows. "Efficiency, 94%, Elric stated, making a note in his notebook. "Poor fellow," Maretta said quietly, looking after Oliver. "He so hoped to get rich. But now he won't turn all of Hogwarts into a madhouse," Theoden remarked pragmatically. "Enough work for today. Tomorrow we'll see if the ink fever has subsided." They left the greenhouse, leaving behind only the smell of damp earth and shattered ambitions. The first case of the Club of Three Keys was drawing to a close. Chapter 7. Resolution with the Scent of Mandrake. The next morning Hogwarts woke up different. The strange theatrical tension that had hung in the air the previous days was gone. In the great hall at breakfast, there were no duels on toast, no revolutionary marches. The students behaved like ordinary, slightly sleep-deprived pupils, grumbling about upcoming exams and sharing the latest gossip. Theoden, observing this idyllic picture, noted with satisfaction in his notebook, "Symptoms of ink fever completely gone. Version of amateur production confirmed." However, complete victory was still some way off. They needed to make sure Oliver Dexton didn't change his mind and resume his dangerous experiments. For this, the final act of their operation was required. It was at that moment that Professor Snape entered the great hall. His black eyes slowly scanned the hall, stopping at each table. When his gaze fell on the Hufflepuff table, Oliver Dexton paled to the point where he could have competed in pallor with the ghosts. Snape didn't say anything. He simply walked to the staff table, but that meaningful look did its job. Oliver sat motionless, as if paralyzed by fear. "Interesting," Elric remarked, observing the scene from his table. "Did Snape actually suspect something, or is it just a coincidence?" "There are no coincidences in Hogwarts," Theoden parried. "But I think it's our doing. Yesterday I spread a rumor that Snape was interested in the greenhouses. Apparently, he really decided to check that information. After breakfast, Oliver tried to slip away unnoticed, but he was intercepted by Professor Sprout. The kindly Hufflepuff looked unusually stern. "Mr. Dexton," she said, blocking his path, "I have received alarming information about your hobbies. Would you care to explain?" Oliver froze like a rabbit before a snake. His eyes darted around, looking for an escape. I was just interested in fungi for my project, Professor." "For a project?" Sprout raised an eyebrow. "Then I assume you won't refuse to help me transplant the mandrakes? Without earmuffs, so you can better understand their nature." Oliver's face fell. Transplanting mandrakes without ear protection was one of the most dreaded punishments in Sprout's arsenal. Their scream could deafen for several hours, and with prolonged exposure, even drive one mad. "I would be delighted, Professor," he mumbled, with the air of a man walking to the scaffold. The trio watched this scene from their hiding place behind a column. "Psychologically effective punishment," Elric noted. The fear of the mandrake's cry will deter him from experimenting with psychoactive substances for a long time. And physically effective, Theoden added. After a day with mandrakes, he won't have the strength to even think about ink. Maretta looked at Oliver with slight pity. I still feel sorry for him. He just wanted to be famous. There are healthy ways to do that. Theoden shook his head, like winning the Quidditch Cup, or not turning classmates into Shakespearean actors. Over the next week, the ink fever completely subsided. The students who had recently been acting out historical dramas and space odysseys now waved away questions about their strange behavior with embarrassment. The Gryffindors, serving their punishment with Snape, preferred to silently poke around in congealed cauldrons, only occasionally exchanging furtive glances full of shame and bewilderment. As for Oliver Dexton, he became a living warning to all lovers of illegal potion-making. After 3 days of working with mandrakes, he walked around the castle with a glazed look and constantly listened to something others couldn't hear. They said he even twitched and covered his ears in his sleep. The trio gathered in their headquarters, the abandoned arithmancy classroom, to sum up the operation. Elric laid out the final report with graphs and statistics on the table. Total number of individuals affected by the modified ink, 37, he read. Full recovery occurred in all cases within 48 hours of cessation of contact with the source. No side effects detected. All stocks of Shimmering Sapphire have been removed from Honeydukes at Professor Snape's insistence, Theoden added. Mr. Flappity received a strict reprimand for selling uncertified products. Maretta, meanwhile, was flipping through her notebook. I found a mention that Madame Rosier has discontinued production of this ink. It turned out she also received an anonymous letter warning of possible consequences. Theoden gave a restrained smile. How interesting. What a coincidence. They sat in a comfortable silence, feeling not anxiety, but satisfaction from a job well done for the first time in a long while. Outside the window, the sun was setting, painting the castle walls in golden hues. Our cooperation proved extremely effective. Elric broke the silence. The combination of observation, analysis, and information-gathering methods yielded a result impossible to achieve individually. We were a good team, Maretta said quietly. Theoden looked at them both, at the logical Ravenclaw with his charts and the modest Hufflepuff with her encyclopedic knowledge, and at himself, a Slytherin who could see connections where others saw only chaos. You know, he began, setting aside his notebook, things are constantly happening at Hogwarts. Strange things, mysteries, incidents. Usually, Potter and his friends take them on, and everything ends with loud explosions and destruction. Inefficient, Elric remarked. And too noisy, added Maretta. Exactly, Theoden nodded. But there are mysteries that require not brute force, but a subtle approach, an approach based on information, analysis, and systematization. He looked around the dusty classroom with its complex formulas on the walls. Maybe we should make our, temporary coalition permanent? Elric thought for a second, then nodded. Logical. Combining our abilities increases the probability of successfully resolving such incidents by 73%. I don't mind, said Maretta, and a rare confidence flashed in her eyes. Then I declare our first official meeting open, Theoden proclaimed with slight theatricality. We need a name. Chapter 8. the Club of Three Keys. Suggestions came one after another. Elric, true to his analytical mind, proposed the Alliance of Reason. Theoden, with his inherent drama, suggested the Society of Secret Pathfinders. Maretta timidly offered the Union of Silent Observers. Too pompous, Theoden rejected Elric's idea. Too noisy, Maretta objected to Theoden's proposal. Too passive, Elric concluded regarding Maretta's option. They sat in thoughtful silence, searching for words. And then Theoden's gaze fell on the classroom door, old oak with 3 keyholes long clogged with dust. 3, he said suddenly. There are 3 of us, and we have 3 keys to solving any mystery. He pointed at Elric. Logic and analysis, at Maretta. Knowledge and memory, at himself. Information and connections. He shifted his gaze to the door. The Club of Three Keys, how does that sound? Elric nodded approvingly. Maretta smiled. I like it. Then it's decided, Theoden said triumphantly, snapping the lock of his notebook shut. The Club of Three Keys commences operations. Headquarters, here. He looked around the dusty room with its broken globe and cobwebs in the corners. The place was far from ideal, but it was theirs. Now for the rules, Theoden continued, suddenly becoming serious. First, complete confidentiality. No one, and I mean absolutely no one, should know of our existence. Logical, Elric agreed. Our efficiency directly depends on maintaining secrecy. Second, we only deal with mysteries that pose a real threat to Hogwarts or its inhabitants. We are not interested in school gossip or love dramas. Maretta nodded, clearly pleased with this point. And third, decisions are made jointly. Everyone has a vote. He looked at his new comrades. All 3 understood. They were creating not just a club. They were creating a secret organization whose goal was to protect the school using methods no one else could or would use. Let's start by documenting our first case, Elric suggested, pulling out a fresh scroll. The case of the ink fever. Investigation start date. While Elric meticulously recorded all the details of their first joint investigation, Theoden watched Maretta. She sat quietly in the corner, but a slight smile played on her face. For the first time in a long while, she looked not like a frightened student, but like a person who had found her place. You know, Theoden broke the silence, I think there are plenty more secrets in Hogwarts that require our attention. Somewhere deep in the castle, as if in response, the portrait of the sleeping Duchess sighed sadly, sensing new mysteries that would soon need to be solved by 3 unusual students. Suddenly, the classroom door creaked. All 3 flinched and froze. On the threshold stood a deferential goblin with a broom in his hands, one of the castle cleaners. Begging your pardon, the goblin mumbled. I've come to sweep. We were just leaving, Theoden said quickly, standing up and signaling discreetly for the others to do the same. When they stepped out into the corridor, Maretta whispered, We need a more reliable place. Agreed, Elric nodded. The probability of accidental discovery here is high, Theoden interrupted. I'll take care of a new place. For now, our duties. Elric, compile a detailed report on the case. Maretta, gather information on other unexplained incidents at Hogwarts in recent years. And you? Asked Maretta. I'll find us a new headquarters, Theoden replied mysteriously, and continue to monitor certain individuals. They dispersed to different ends of the corridor, 3 figures in robes of different houses, united by a common secret. The Club of Three Keys had begun its work. From the diary of Theoden Voxwell, so ink fever is officially defeated. Oliver Dexton is now learning Zen through mandrake transplantation, and Professor Snape has a new batch of reasons to hate Gryffindor. The world has returned to its usual course. It's just interesting. While half the school was marching to the Marseillaise and acting out Shakespeare, our ever-present trio Potter, Granger, Weasley didn't even stir. Either their immunity to ink was stronger, or they were too busy preparing for their next grand mission to save the world. They say Weasley tried to turn his potions homework into gold last week. The result, as usual, exploded. Heroes. By the way, if it weren't for my accidental finds in the persons of Riddleway and Quillwood, the epidemic could have lasted for weeks. But who counts these little things? The whole of Hogwarts is now talking only about Potter's new broom. Amazing. Now about my new partners. Riddleway, a walking calculator with social disability. Today at breakfast, he tried to calculate the optimal temperature for toasted toast. But damn, when that brain is aimed at the right target, it delivers results, as long as it doesn't get bogged down in probability theory of another failure. Quillwood, a quiet one, smelling of ink and old books, seems like a standard Hufflepuff. But beneath this modesty lies the stubbornness of a bulldog. And more importantly, she's not afraid to say no. When Riddleway started developing a scheme for total scanning of the castle for ink residue, she made him reconsider his plans with one look. Priceless. Tomorrow is our first meeting. Riddleway has already sent a protocol with 17 points. Quillwood secretly asked me to cut this madness short. It seems our trio is doomed to an eternal struggle between logic, practicality, and my healthy cynicism. P.S. Passing by the Forbidden Forest today, I saw Hagrid trying to tame a new pet, something hairy and clearly dangerous. It seems a new season of idiocy is starting at Hogwarts. How timely that we created our club.